Hey, so I am supposed to be a Schrödinger's cat, I wonder if I should speak or I should meow, but I'm not good at
I'm
meowing.
fine with the meow.
So yeah, fine. Well, we can try. We can do a survey of the attendees, what they like more. Okay, so first of all, apologies to those of you who have already seen this talk, because it's the same talk that I gave for the school, but we will elaborate it in a slightly different way. So the idea is to study side by side nonlinear dynamics in neurophysiology, so in the brain essentially, and in analog electronic circuits. So I'll introduce the general idea, then I will show some of the circuits that I believe are of some interest. Then we will look at pattern generation with those circuits, finally engineering applications. So the starting idea is quite simple, and it is the observation that there are deep, deep differences between how engineered things, such as computers, work and how our brain works. For example, computation happens by design according to fixed architectures in computers. We have little or no redundancy. We don't want computations to be done many times, usually. We need high reliability, and we don't like noise, and we work at very high frequencies. All these statements are negated by the brain. The brain has no fixed architecture. It's very messy, largely self-organized. Information is represented in a very diffuse way, and noise is not only present, but essential. Furthermore, the clock frequencies, or rather the activity frequencies, are 1 million times lower. So it's very clear there is a deep difference, and the difference is most of all architecture. Now, one key aspect is that if we consider modern neural networks, etc., they typically have no spontaneous activity. Meaning, if we have a shallow or a deep network, the propagation of information is exactly set by the structural connections, in this case from the left to the right. No input, no output. For the brain, it's completely different, because more than 80% of information processing and metabolic load in the brain goes into intrinsic activity. And we have a huge difference in power efficiency. A single GPU, with which you cannot do that much, already consumes more than 10 times a human brain. And of course, no need for me to talk about network topology here. In one case, we have essentially lattice structures. In the case of the brain, we have highly complex networks that have multiple features overlapping. However, we don't know how to train such networks. Now, what fascinated me very much is all these differences, and I ask myself the question, can we try to design some kind of electronics that will go closer to what we have in the brain, but without necessarily trying to copy its structure and without any fancy technologies? And that's what I'm going to talk about today. In particular, I'm going to talk about three types of connectivity. The structural connectivity, which is the physical presence of connections in the brain. Functional connectivity, which is essentially synchronization, so which regions synchronize. And effective connectivity, which is the perturbation of a synchronization by stimuli, be them external or internal stimuli. In particular, I'm going to try to show some experiments that show how synchronization is influenced by structural connectivity via dynamics. And this is a very general statement that I will elaborate in a minute. All these things you already know, but I want to say just one last thing before we start. Why bother to do all this that you will see experimentally? There are several reasons. One reason is that the physical or biological reality is highly, highly rich. We have all sorts of parametric mismatches. We have non-ideal behaviors. We have multiple sources of noise, etc., etc., etc. All these things can, in principle, be captured numerically, of course. However, this carries a very heavy price. Carries a very heavy price in terms of computational load, and carries a very heavy price in terms of accuracy, in fact. So it turns out that experimental investigation is quite inspiring and is not just a confirmation of simulations. So this is the first circuit that I started with many years ago. And as you see, it's a totally innocent looking electronic circuit made with very old technology. But as we sweep some of the component parameters, the dynamics undergo phase transitions between order and chaos, and within the chaotic regions, they show quite well-developed, fine-grained structure. So even though the circuit is so simple, it is highly generative in terms of dynamics. If we look qualitatively at the time series, for examples, we see phenomena such as the generation of volleys, shown here, which are closely reminiscent to what we get biologically, for example, in post-synaptic potentials. Now, if I was looking for sensationalism, I would say these are artificial neurons. But of course, they are not. They have nothing to do. They lack the structure, they lack everything. They are not neurons. And that's exactly why they are interesting. They are interesting because even though they are not neurons, they show some similar behaviors. But the problem is that we don't know how to synthesize these circuits. Many years ago, when my life was more settled, I used an approach based on genetic algorithms to describe the structure and the component values of these circuits using a bit string, and ran a very large-scale search. This very large-scale search revealed more than 100 new circuits, some of which were highly recurrent. The one that you see here on the top is the simplest one that was found and is the one that received the most attention because it is extremely elementary yet has many interesting behaviors. But is also notable the one down here, which, as you can see, generates a kind of all or nothing spike train, which is quite reminiscent of presynaptic activity, even though obviously it has nothing to do with a neuron. You can then play around a lot. Now, I spare you the details, but you can make the dynamics richer by including resonators that have a fractal structure, such as the ones shown here, so trying to copy the dendritic trees. For those of you who like such things, you can also create a fractional order versions of these circuits, and you get incredibly complex dynamics. All of this based on just one nonlinearity, one active element, a single transistor. And that's a remarkable testament to the generative potential of these objects, I think. Then you can go down an engineering route and try to build circuits that are more friendly to integrate on an integrated circuit. So here you see some underlying ideas implemented differently. We have 3 inverter rings having lengths 3, 5, 7. And these inverter rings disturb each other because they are coupled, but they cannot easily phase lock except on very long periods. So as we change the amount of current through these rings, all sorts of behaviors emerge. You get spiking, as shown here, all the way down to noise-like signal generation. Now that's incredible, because this is just one dynamical system and a very elementary circuit, and look how diversified the dynamics can be. I think this is interesting. I spare you the details on this because of time, but you can get similar results also using gas discharge tubes. And in here, in particular, you can see first-order phase transitions coexisting with second-order phenomena such as critical scaling, which is quite surprising because we found a near perfect agreement with biological activity. Again, no mystery, it's because they belong to the same universality class, that of a branching process, but it is remarkable. I skip all this. Now that we have done all these beautiful things, it is time to generate some networks. And a network that is inherently fascinating is a ring, because a ring is sort of unique in the realm of elementary networks, because it has a very high degree of symmetry. Each node will see the first, second, third neighbors all the same. It's not the case for a star, it's not the case for a ladder or a chain. So if we build a network like this with oscillators that are coupled somehow using resistors, what do we get? We get that there is a critical coupling strength, critical in inverted commas, that gives very strong formation of communities. Now, you have surely seen talks very advanced about how this can be predicted, but this was just a humble experimental work. And what we got is that we consistently observed the formation of these communities, and the distribution of size of these communities varied as a function of the coupling, potentially leading to highly changeable configurations, which is exactly what we get in the human brain. If you study it under resting conditions, you see it as a strong modular structure, of course, but this structure is not stationary. It sort of has a breathing-like effect. Then this can be made more advanced by looking at remote synchronization. So rings that are made of a slightly more complex circuit can show effects whereby adjacent nodes are synchronized, then after some distance you lose the synchronization, and after some further steps you gain it again, which obviously is impossible. This only means that we have a form of generalized synchronization at a certain distance, which we are not able to see, and eventually this gets translated again into a phase synchronization. But it's interesting because it is completely self-organized. Now, if we use information theoretical models, we can decode very well that actually there is nothing mystical, that there is just a gradient. But this is not immediately observable by synchronization measures alone. And then we can do manipulations such as knocking out individual nodes by using white noise. And what we get is that in most cases we have desynchronization locally, which is to be expected. And in a minority of cases, we have a remote enhancement of synchronization, which is a phenomenon that has been described before, though not systematically. But the interesting thing here is that we get it in a very simple network and very consistently. And this is another effect that we get very repeatably in the brain. And it is the basis, for example, of deep brain stimulation. Another interesting thing is that we can perturb each node by kicking it at a very low intensity and then do a time-locked average. And we see that as we kick each node, we have a decent response. But this response is absolutely not propagated, showing that the network is highly selective, which is, again, a very curious finding about the brain. This can be studied using EEG with transcranial magnetic stimulation, and the integrity of this selectivity is a hallmark of normal brain function. I will jump through all these things, and I want to look at applications because we don't have much time, and I want to show something a little bit concrete. So one aspect that is interesting is creating toy models. So toy models are not realistic by definition. A toy model is something that is brutally simplified so that we only keep the fundamental features that are necessary to test a hypothesis. So here we have a toy model of what we call a default mode network in the brain. So a network that has 4 node regions that are interdigitated and interconnected by one of these hubs, which would be the precuneus at the back of the brain. And what we get in real brain recordings is that these hub regions have large amplitude, low frequency, very structured fluctuations. Now, if we make a network like this and we try to measure it, we get exactly the same phenomenon electronically. Anything mystical? Probably not. This is an effect that has been studied by other people, such as the group of Gustavo Deco, etc. But the key point is that here we get it experimentally. And this is very interesting because the reality is much richer compared to the numerical case, and one acquisition takes 10 milliseconds. One numerical simulation would take 10 hours. So this kind of setup is interesting because it gives us data that is to some extent neural-like, but with a known ground truth, because we built the system, we know the connectivity, and we can do parameter sweeps, etc., etc., etc. Now, on this basis, we wanted to try to reconstruct the synchronization. And on that basis, in turn, to detect the presence of structural connections. Now, if we use a standard phase docking value, you see the results here. The results are quite interesting because you see the coupled regions very well. You also clearly see a clustering, community formation on the diagonal, but you also see a lot of diffusion of synchronization. We introduced a variant of synchronization that allows to capture the phase amplitude locking. And for a suitable setting of the parameter, you get something like this, which is much more restrictive and much more representative of the structural connections. So obviously we became interested in this measure. And we applied it to a real EEG of a person. And it worked extremely well, to the point that we could detect imaginary commands to allow us driving a robot around the room in this kind of 8-shaped figure. So we found a way to improve the way, excuse me, we found a way to improve how we do brain state decoding based on a synchronization measure that was discovered on data from an electronic system. And this is very paradigmatic, because if we did not have this system, we would not have a training ground, we would not have a gym to try to exercise and get better measures that we can later apply to the data. Another application is bio-inspired motor control. Here you see a robot, and it requires spatial-temporal patterns for its locomotion. Typically, these patterns are generated using quite complex algorithms and quite ad hoc algorithms. Here, we were able to show that we can recapitulate all of the patterns needed using a relatively simple hierarchical network with a central pattern generator and a local pattern generator. And the key ingredient in these nodes was the circuit that I showed you before we used to study remote synchronization. So we can use these circuits to do pattern formation and solve practical problems. The key point is that the power consumption is extremely low, and that you can have, in this case, fully analog control. Another approach is in sensing. So you can imagine you have a sensor network. Imagine this node is a sensor, where one element is made sensitive to an environmental variable. For example, there is a solar cell capturing the amount of light. And then the nodes together are coupled, for example, via an inductor or an antenna. Now, if you put them together close enough, they can begin to behave collectively in a situation where they are partially synchronized, so not fully synchronized, but maybe an average synchronization of 0.5, 0.6, etc. In such cases, from one time series, meaning the time series that we receive from the average signal of all of them, we can decode the mean and the standard deviation of this parameter. So now these are old results, but there are new results now that show that we can do this even for thousands of nodes. So you can get at least the lowest statistical moments without having to interrogate each node individually. Okay, this is stuff for engineers, but it's just showing that you can do this in the microwave range, because engineers like nowadays microwaves because they give small antennas, and we can overcome a fundamental problem. The chaos is generally broadband, especially in these circuits, but it is possible to couple them even with a thin spectral slice, which is very important because it is impossible for legal and technical reasons to transmit a broadband signal. Here we go back to the circuit I showed you before that generates neural-like activity. You see an oscilloscope recording here. Now, we made a small network called Sakura 1 with 10 nodes. The connectivity is essentially like a small Watson-Strogatz network. And what we get is that there are quite interesting phenomena, such as the formation of communities, competition between communities, non-monotonic relationships between coupling and synchronization. So, due to this non-triviality, we can imagine to use this as a reservoir. A reservoir meaning a projector, from a low-dimensional input layer to a higher dimensional output layer. Basically something that replaces the convolutional layers of a deep neural network and can help us to solve some problems. For example, in image classification. Yeah, I'm in time. Thank you. I will need even less. So we can make this kind of physical reservoirs. So a very simple circuit with 20 transistors that can solve tasks that otherwise need much larger networks. And another crazy application, now I'm just exemplifying, is in the Internet of Things. Maybe some of you are interested in this. And we had a problem. We had a problem of classifying cow behaviors based on the readings of an accelerometer. Very good performance with convolutional neural networks. Problem: we need 2 years battery life. Impossible unless a cow carries 50 kilos of battery. So eventually we used an approach where we developed an analog implementation of a Rössler system. We chose the Rössler system for certain properties that I will not elaborate now. And we used this as a nonlinear signal processor, essentially as a single node reservoir, where we administer here, there are 3 systems, the external signal from one channel of the accelerometer, and we get as output the 3 variables. So we generate additional time series in this way. And we could do this in the analog domain, so very low power. As a consequence of that, if we look at the spectrogram of the input signal, it's quite poor in this case. As you can imagine, it's movement from a cow. I mean, it's kind of a jerky signal without much structure. But if we look at the output of the Rössler system disturbed by this, it has a lot more structure, some of which has an obvious connection to the input and some not. The consequence is that if we feed this time series to a very small neural network, more than 10 times smaller than a CNN, we could solve the problem with adequate performance. So, these are just some examples of what can be done with these circuits. And this part is in Chinese, and I want to thank you for your attention, and let's have some discussion. Now, I didn't mention high-order interactions now, but there are some recent results that we just published on CSF showing that we can create triplets with high-order interactions using these kind of circuits. And these triplets show very clearly interaction patterns that are non-factorizable. So I don't discuss this for reasons of time, but it is just a confirmation that results such as these ones can in the future be expanded to more complex couplings. That's all for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Ludovico. Perfect timing. Perfect timing. So we have, oh, no perfect timing. On the microphone. Yeah, there was. I turned it on. Perfect timing. I already saw one question here booked, another question there booked. Anyone? Third question there. We should have time for all 3. I'll go them in order of raising hands. Number 1.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, clearly.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for such a nice talk. So can you put back the gate pattern generator?
Yes.
So you have a bunch of modules there. Each one, no, actually was, yeah, that one. So you have a bunch of modules, each one controlling the leg, each leg, right? And so what are the nodes there and the edges, and how did you design this network? So how do you design the edges in particularly?
Okay, nice question. Nice question. I already understood what you want. So each node was taken from the previous study. So we took this circuit here, which has quite rich dynamics, and that we used before to study remote synchronization. Then we built the central pattern generator. How? By taking the three most important gates, the wave gate, the tetrapod gate, and the tripod gate, and we created the three sets of connections overlapping to realize these gates. We then use a fuzzy approach in order to smoothly transition between them and to manage the overlap between these connections. Then, for each leg, we have three nodes because there are three actuators, 3 degrees of freedom per leg. And what we have there, we have essentially a ring. It's a small ring that generates the required trajectory, but this ring, as you can see, receives an input, a diffuse input from the corresponding central node. In this way, using 5 high-level parameters, essentially hyperparameters, and more than 50 low-level parameters, we can get practically any realistic gate.
All right. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Second question
Welcome.
from here.
Thank you for a presentation. I have a basic question, but can you explain again the meaning of the matrix, especially in the first slides? We have some red regions and some blue regions, and for me, I didn't understand very well what
In the first,
the first
sorry,
slides.
where, which slide?
But I think not this one. Oh, no, 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 no. Yes, like this
This?
one. Yes.
Oh, no. These are just, sorry, I didn't express it. These are synchronization matrices. So this ring has 30 elements. And so these are 30 by 30 matrices, where each entry is a synchronization value. So each entry shows how synchronized each node is with respect to all the others. Now, the connectivity is a ring, which means that if synchronization were to copy perfectly the connectivity, we would have two diagonal lines, one just above and one just below the actual diagonal. But in practice, what we have is a growth of communities or clusters that grow in a way like crystals along the diagonal.
Thank you.
Welcome.
We have there you go. We have one more question from here as well.
Okay, thank you for the presentation, Professor. I actually have a question about how do you measure phase synchronization?
Oh, okay. Well, there are standard ways. One way that is very common, which is the one that we generally use, it is based on reconstructing the instantaneous phase. So you start with a real-time series. You calculate the analytic signal via Hilbert's transform. You move to polar coordinates, and you have the instantaneous phase. Now, once you have the instantaneous phase, you can take the complex exponential of the difference, and then the average, and then the modulus, which is the equivalent essentially to one of the Kuramoto order parameters. And in this way, you get a measure that runs from 0, complete asynchrony, to 1, complete synchrony. This measure has been used for more than 20 years. It is widely accepted. We should be careful, however, because there are hidden dangers, in the sense that, for example, if the activity is not phase coherent, phase synchronization may be misleading. But it's a good first approximation.
So So you are doing an interpolation to create an electrical function.
I am not interpolating. No. I'm saying, so you ask me how I calculate phase synchronization?
Yeah.
So how I said, if you give me two time series, whether they are biological or whether they come from two nodes on this board, you have two time series. What can you do? Okay, one possibility is that you can take the correlation, for example. Correlation is good, but is sensitive to amplitudes. And sometimes you don't want this. So in that case, the standard way is to transfer both time series to the corresponding analytic signals. Get the instantaneous phases and look at the coherence of these phases. And this is a very standard approach.
Okay, coherence is more familiar for me. Thank you.
Okay, good.
Okay, we have just time for a super quick comment from here.
10-second comment. In fact, phases are, defined only for periodic systems.
Exactly.
Phase is one
Exactly.
of the. So if you have a chaotic systems, all definition of phases are just approximation of, but you don't have a rigorous definition of phase. Only if the chaotic system is phase coherent, that is, does a spectrum which is very well centered around the mean frequency, then you can expect to have something. But a phase is the inverse of a period. Dot.
Okay, we will truncate here. I
Clear.
can tell if anyone has any other question, by all means do write to Ludovico. I can tell you, he will
Of course.
give you all answers. I can guarantee that he's a super nice guy and will be very happy with that. But we are out of time, so let's thank him again before passing to the next speaker. So next speaker is also online. In fact, he's already online.
Bye-bye.
It's Silvio Ferreira. And let's see if we can switch the presentation, hopefully.
I'm not
Okay,
able. Let's try.
Yeah, I think Ludovico needed to stop sharing, which he did, so you can probably start sharing now.
Let's try.
Let's see.
Yeah. Yes. Now it will work.
It's coming up.
Can you see my presentation?
Yes, very good. And okay, so we talk a little bit more about spreading processes right now.